Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for all joining on to the webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is how unconscious bias affects our decisions. My name is Dan Sanders, and I'm from the iMechie's training team, and our presenter today will be Paul Taylor. If you have any questions, technical-based ones, please let us know in the chat room, and one of the technical team will be able to message you direct and support you, and we'll be able to support you. If during the session you have any questions for Paul during the webinar, please do ask these questions into the chat, into the attendee chat box, and we will we'll do our best to get round to answering these questions as many as we can at the time. But we will also try to have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, I will now pass you over to Paul, who will be able to now take you forward through this session. Enjoy.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. My name's Paul Taylor. I'll just introduce myself very briefly. My background originally was in sales and marketing before moving into consultancy and then training. I've been working with iMechie in various capacities for the last 20 years or so, delivering leadership and commercial programs around the world. So that's me. Let's get on to why you're here. So I'm just going to warm up with a few slides that illustrate how the brain can play tricks or maybe fix reality for you. So here's the first one. Have a look at the two squares there labeled A or B, and try to decide which of those two squares is the darker. Okay, so what you're probably thinking is that A is the darker square. So let me show you this rectangle that has now appeared on the screen is the same color as both A and B, as you can see. So what's happened is that your brain has fixed reality for you. It's expecting that B is the lighter one, and has so converted it in your mind to see it in that way, because you're looking obviously at a chessboard, and this is how chessboards are. And it's the contrast of the darkest squares around it that creates this misperception. So another famous one, if you look at the two lines here, the horizontal lines, no doubt in your mind it looks as if the top one is longer, because the angled lines at the end of the lines are going outwards, leading your brain to kind of expand that line. So if I show you the two lines on their own, you'll see that they are in fact the same length, but our brains don't see it that way. So have a read through this. I'll just go quiet for a moment. So that's fairly mind-blowing. I don't know how easy it is for you to read that if English is not your first language. Perhaps you can drop into the text chat if you find it relatively easy if English isn't your first language. But for most people, we can read the text almost as if it's there's nothing wrong with it if the words are in the. I've just seen Valentin's comment there. Terrible spell check. Yeah, very good. but the reason it works is because we don't actually read the letters, of course. We read the word as a whole. What the brain is very good at is pattern recognition, and it can quickly sort out the right pattern based upon what it's usually seeing and also what it's expecting to see. So as soon as you see the capital K in Cambridge, you probably got an idea because it's about research that it is going to be Cambridge. And then, of course, university is very easy to make that second guess. It's the expectation that makes it easier. Okay, have a quick read through this. Now, as you read through that, I've no doubt that certain things will have popped into your mind about the characters in this story. You will have created a picture in your mind and filled out the narrative with some details. And probably, like most people, you made some assumptions about gender, about who's driving the car, and maybe who the gender of the doctor. And what most people believe is that the doctor is male and that the driver is female because of the child, and of course we tend to perceive doctors as being male. And in fact, if you do a Google search, Google image search, what you will find is that something like 75% of images of doctors are male, whereas in reality, more than half of GPs in the UK are female. But we have this because of media, because of our experience in consuming news and so on, tends us to think in particular ways. And that's kind of what today's about, how we think in particular ways and how our brain can lead us to have the wrong perception of the world and then to interpret our perception wrongly. So this is a brief agenda. We're going to talk about two systems, how the two systems interact, and then the kind of errors that we can get, and finishing with, okay, so what can we do about it? Okay, so the two systems. The two systems was a way of thinking about the brain that was developed by a guy called Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And if you only read one book, one non-fiction book, that should be the book. Kahneman is the real deal. He's a Nobel Prize winner. Did most of the research that's featured in the book himself with his partner Tversky. And so he's not some kind of pop psychology person who's talking about things they don't really understand. Now, what Kahneman said is we can think of the brain as having two systems in it. Now, he wasn't talking anatomically here. He's not saying that there is a part of the brain that's system one and a part that is system two. So this idea of left and right brain thinking has now been pretty much abandoned. The brain is just a lot more complex. What Kahneman was describing with system 1, 2 is how the brain appears to work. So parts of system 1 and parts of system 2 anatomically are in the same part of the brain, but it's a descriptive system. System 1 is fast. It's like reflexes in your body. It's unconscious. You don't think about it. It's simply things that are happening below the level of consciousness, automatic, everyday decisions. So lots of things that you do every day, which you don't even think that there is something to be thought It simply happens. And System 1 is also error prone. System 1 basically operates based on patterns, and sometimes it gets the pattern wrong, and that's when it can lead to errors. And that's a lot of what today is about, is how System 1 gets it wrong. Now, System 1 can be seen as your primal brain, the brain that kept your ancestors alive tens of thousands of years ago. It's the brain that responds automatically and unconsciously to the environment. So it's our common ancestors who heard a rustle in a bush and made the decision to run away rather than go and have a look in case it was some food, when it could just as easily have been a predator like a lion or tiger. And that's what System 1 is really about. It's about keeping you alive. It's about helping you to make those good decisions, but make them quickly, because there often isn't time to think and analyze a situation. You just need to act. And the problem for us now in a much more complex, sophisticated world is that we have the same machinery of cognition, the System 1, still operating and jumping to conclusions, but sometimes jumping to the wrong conclusion. So this is why System 1 is necessary. We have a ton of information, 11 pieces of information at any one time are entering your brain through your senses. And we have to do something with all that information. And typically what we need to do is we need to filter it out. We need to get rid of it so that we can deal with what is important. And that's what System 1 is doing. So you have sensory information coming in to the visual cortex eventually. Now, the visual cortex is part of a later stage of brain development. Your cortex is where rational thinking takes place. But before it gets to the cortex, it's analyzed by the more primal parts of your brain, sometimes referred to as the limbic system. And the limbic system is kind of operating as this filter. So if I just move on a second, the limbic system is filtering this information out. And only certain information gets through to System 2. So right now, you're probably not thinking about the clothes that you're wearing and how they're touching your skin, so your sleeve on your arm, but you are now. You're probably not thinking about where your tongue is in your mouth, but you are now. Because System 1 has basically said, that's of no interest to me. It's unchanging, it doesn't pose a threat, let's just filter it out. The issue we have is sometimes it filters out information that is actually valuable and that is useful. Now, the information that does get through is processed by System 2, and System 2 is slow. System 2 is what you think about when you think about thinking. It's conscious thinking. It takes effort. And that's why we sometimes get lazy and we just go with what's sometimes referred to as our gut reaction, our intuition. That's System 1 thinking. System 2 can bring in different pieces of information. It's complex. It can weigh things up, analyze them. It can decide that there is more for an idea rather than against it. System 1 doesn't look at the quantity and quality of the information. It sees a pattern and jumps to a conclusion. So let's look at how the systems work together. So we have habits. So habits are things like folding your arms. You may fold your arms a particular way. So when you do fold your arms, if you do it right now, is your right hand on your bicep of your left arm, or is it underneath? Do you have your left arm underneath, or is it on your right arm bicep? Now, you didn't think about that, you just did it. Playing an instrument, this is where the more you practice, the more you create neural pathways that are easy to access. And after a time, once you begin the process, the rest of the connections take place automatically. So if you think about learning to play the piano or the guitar, at the beginning you're consciously trying to place your fingers in a particular place. But once you can play, you don't think like that. It's handed over to System 1. So what I'm trying to say is I've painted System 1 as being this thing that can lead to errors, but it is absolutely necessary in our lives. It filters out the deluge of information that we get, but it also enables us to do things, complex things, easily and unconsciously. And it saves the mental effort of System 2 thinking. So driving a car, if you drove to work this morning and you drive a manual car or a stick, as the Americans say, you probably can't remember changing gear. But think back to your very first driving lesson. Then it was full of System 2 conscious thinking. And again, putting your trousers on, which leg do you put in first? How do you clean your teeth? Which side do you start on? These are all System 1 things that are useful to us. So I'm not saying we should try to close System 1 off. It's very useful, but what we're concerned with is using it in the right way. So he approached the bank. Again, you probably have an idea in your mind about what bank that is, and it's probably something like this. But it could just as easily have been this, the riverbank. But again, we jump to conclusions, and the issue we have when it comes to making decision is that once we've reached a conclusion about something, we tend to look for evidence to confirm the conclusion that we've come to. In other words, we start off in a neutral place, but we get on one side of the line. And once we're thinking in a particular way, the brain can run away with that. We interpret things in a particular way because of our initial, very first thought. Okay, so patterns of thinking. Have a look at the words that appear on this slide and then answer the question that appears on the slide in your head or out loud, depending on where you are, but answer it quickly. Don't overthink it. So read the words going from top to bottom and then answer the final question. Okay, I'd be surprised if your answer wasn't milk at that point, because you've been primed, your brain has been primed, and there's a kind of principle called Hebb's rule, based after a neuroscientist called Hebb, which is basically that neurons that wire together fire together, and neurons that fire together wire together. In other words, if neurons are active, if there are associations created, then those associations will activate different clusters of neurons. So it's the way it's where our creativity comes from. When you think of one thing, your mind, like a grasshopper, can jump to another thing and then another thing. But because of the connections that are already in existence, we're kind of primed to think in a particular way. So what was happening there in your brain is you were thinking of white. You associate. And then I introduce cow, and what's associated with cows and white, it's milk. And so your brain goes in a particular direction. Now, okay, this is silly. But the whole point is that when you're making bigger decisions, these same flaws or brain bugs, as a famous book on this called them, are still happening. I'm just going to have a quick look at a question here. Okay, so a good question from the attendees. When approaching a difficult situation, is it a matter of stepping back and using System 2? It's a great question, and if I can answer that, it's from Reese. Thanks, Reese. In a little while, I'm going to come at the end of the talk about, okay, so how do we handle it? But in essence, Reese, yes, you're kind of leading with the question is right. It is a matter of stepping back and letting System 2 come to the fore. Okay, so another little illustration of how our brains play games. So there are two words on the screen. You can see that house is written in blue ink. So I'm going to show you another slide. The next slide will have a whole range of words, and the words are all colors, and each color is written in a particular colored ink, but it isn't the color of the color, okay? So what I want you to read is to say out loud, if you can, or at least in your mind, what I want you to say is not to read the word, but to say the color of the word, okay? So in this case, if I said, look here, you would say blue-gray, not house car. So blue-gray. That's what you need to do on the next screen. So it's important that you say this out loud, or at least out loud in your brain. Read it out. Okay, here we go. Okay, if you're like most people, you probably consciously made yourself say green, red, blue, and then you sped up a little bit, and yellow, blue, black, and then you maybe stuttered a little bit towards the end. What's happening there is you have information coming into your brain, the word yellow, but also the color green. And that information is being processed by different parts of your brain. It's essentially a battle to decide which parts of the brain get to the answer first, because you can't help but read yellow, as we saw earlier on with the Cambridge University words. You kind of instinctively read the word, but you're also accessing the color from a different part of your brain. So one way to see the brain is as a set of independent systems that are working in isolation and then being brought together and sense made out of the interpretation that each of these independent systems is delivering. So again, when we come to make big decisions, one of the issues we face is that a particular type of information is getting priority in our brain. And that then becomes the way that we look at it. And so when you hear people talk about intuition, gut feeling, it's that one part of the brain has emerged with an interpretation. You can't quite understand where it came from. It's just a feeling. And then you start to make decisions based upon that feeling. There's another question from Demetrios, which is, does language affect which system we use? For people whose language being spoken is not their mother tongue, I believe it's common to take a step back and rethink what is being considered. Demetrios, I think that's very true, because what happens is when it's not your mother tongue is you're interrupting system one because you have to use system two to do the translation. And that kind of is one of the principles of how do we ensure that we're using the two systems together in the right way, is to interrupt system one sometimes. Okay, let's move on. So here's another little brain teaser for you. So we have a bat and a ball, and together they cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the bat cost? So £1.10 together, the bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the bat cost? Okay, now, most people, when asked that, instinctively say £1 and 10 pence. 10 pence for the ball, £1 for the bat. But of course, that means that the bat is only 90 pence more. And so we have to switch over to hand over to system two to overcome our intuitive answer. The answer is, of course, it's £1 and 5 pence for the bat and ball. But we have an instinctive answer. Now, in this case, you may have thought, oh, come on, that was easy. But it was easy if you found it that way, partly because I'd set it up as, here's something that's going to fool you. What many people would do in the real world in that situation is they'll jump to £1 and 10 pence as the answers and just go with that. And so again, this is what we're trying to guard against. Okay, so what system two does is it will often try and take the easy way out. And the reason comes back to that word on the earlier slide, effortful. System two uses a lot of energy. It's tiring to consciously think about things and analyze things. So what we try to do is we just hand it over to system one. We go with our intuitive feelings. So let me show you some other ways in which this happens. So organ donation schemes, participation. Now you can see that some countries, UK, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, have a much, much lower take-up in terms of organ donation. Why is that? Is it because we just don't care about anyone else? The answer is, of course not. It's simply because of the way that people are asked about organ donation. Check the box if you wish to donate. In other words, you have to opt in versus opt out. And that's pretty much what the difference is about. It's the same question if you think about it, but we just don't make the effort to opt in. Okay, so have a look at this slide. Which option do you think people go with? So we've got economist.com online, $59. Print subscription, $125. Print and web subscription, $125 too. Okay, so is anyone going to go for the middle option, print subscription? Probably not. So we could just abandon it, and we could have 59 and 125, the two options. Why would anyone choose the middle one? So let me show you what happened. So these are the subscription rates when you have all three options. 16% of people choose option 1, with 84% going for option 3, with, of course, nobody choosing the middle one, because that will be the stupid option. But if we look now at what the subscription was when people actually are only given the two options, what we find is that 68% of people go for the online only, yet 84% went for printed subscription. Now, the two prices, 59 and 129, have not changed. But there is an incredible difference in which option gets selected. So, how on earth can that happen? How on earth can people change their mind when, in reality, the options haven't changed? Well, as you can see from the bottom of the slide, Dan Ariely, in a TED Talk, will explain much more about this. But it's essentially showing that the way that our brains are taken in a different direction when we have another option similar to one of the other options. It acts as a kind of anchor. We see that the 125, the middle option, we get less value than the third option. So we want the one that has most value. So that's how we move in the direction towards the print and web. So it again comes back to what we saw in the slide earlier. It's this, the contrast leads us to think in different ways. So another way in which this works is if you think of A and B as being, A is a type of house and B is a different type of house. So let's say A is a traditional old period feature house, B is a modern contemporary new house. And we can't decide between the two. I mean, it's like comparing apples and oranges. So we're not sure which one to go for. But if we introduce another option, another period house, which is similar to, but not as good as the first one we saw, what happens is people then tend to make the choice to go for the period house. In other words, what they do is the decision between A and B is hard. The decision between A and A minus is easier. I make that decision and I assume that I've also made the decision about the difference between A and B. In other words, we make an easier decision and then go along with that easy decision, even though it's not the actual decision we were originally looking at. Nadzone, question here, is there any practice training? Again, if I could come back to that in about 10 minutes time, or maybe even less now, that would be good. Okay, this is a slightly humorous thing from Dan Ariely again. This is Tom and Jerry. So, Tom and Jerry, how do you decide who is the most attractive looking between Tom and Jerry? Well, what's interesting is if we give the option of an ugly Jerry, which is the middle one in the top row, and an ugly Tom in the bottom row, and then we split people into two groups. So group A, see Tom, Jerry, and ugly Jerry. Ugly Jerry, I mean, they're obviously not real people. It's photoshopping Jerry's image. So group A are only shown what's above the line. Group B are only shown what's below the line. And each group is asked, who is the most attractive here? When you see the group A, most people choose Jerry as the most attractive. In group B, most people choose Tom. And it's simply because there is a less attractive version of the chosen one in each group. You make the easy decision and then you almost push the initial decision out of the way. So the message here is clear. If you're single and are looking for a partner, you need to go out with a friend who is a less attractive version of yourself. Of course, don't ever let them know that that's why you're inviting them out. So, just to summarize, this is Kahneman from Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. This is the essence of intuitive heuristics. When faced with a difficult question, we often answer an easier one instead, usually without noticing the substitution. Okay, so this is obviously the question which a number of you have been itching to get to. How do we identify and address these biases? Well, the first one is simply to acknowledge them. And that is the critical thing. The fact of the matter is you are biased. You're human, so you're biased. It's simply you are hardwired to be biased. Your past experiences, your genetics, the culture in which you grew up in, the things that you watch on television, you're biased. You will make different decisions based upon whether you had a good night's sleep last night or a bad night's sleep, because your brain is either going to be full of energy or slightly lazy, and it tends to be when you're under pressure, when you're lacking energy because you didn't have a good night's sleep, that system one is more likely to take over. So that the critical thing is simply acknowledge you are biased. Kahneman, in his in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, towards the end of the book, actually says, after my many years of research of this, I am still just as prone to these cognitive biases as I was before them. You just have to accept it and then try to become more aware of the types of bias that may be getting in the way. So let's just have a quick look through what those biases are. So, affinity bias. Affinity bias is where we tend to go to be more favorably predisposed to people who are similar to us. Now, there's another guy who's written about affinity called Robert Cialdini, who wrote a book called Influence, and he identified 6 persuasion triggers. And these 6 persuasion triggers are essentially the most common form of biases. And the one that he talks about is liking or being like someone. And what Cialdini's research showed is that the liking works at many levels. So it's if you're abroad on holiday and you hear some, you're surrounded by people talking in a different language, and then you hear somebody talking in your language, and you recognize that the accent means they're from your country, and you may even recognize that they're from your region of your country, you will tend to have you will tend to have an affinity towards those people. You tend to be more favorable. You tend to think of them more favorably. So, for instance, if there is a disagreement, let's say you're in a restaurant, between the waiter and the group, then you will tend to be looking from their perspective and thinking, how can I help them? Because they are similar. And it works, Cialdini showed, at many levels. So, for instance, there's a thing called the old boy network or the old school network, where people who went to the same school treat people who went to that school differently. They give them advantages. They make allowances for their mistakes. It's maybe and what it gets even lower. So one of the best things that you can do if you want to try to influence somebody or get them on your side is to find areas of commonality. And that means asking questions at the beginning. So find out, do they, for instance, play the same sport as you? So 2 golfers will initially get on better with each other than people who don't play golf, simply because there is a commonality, and then the affinity bias sets in. People who have children, parents, so find out, do they have kids? Do they have kids the same age? And so on. So look for commonalities between you. Now, I'm not saying that is enough that people will then say, okay, I'll believe everything you say. What it does is it pushes you one side of neutral. You become biased, and you can become biased in a positive way or a negative way. So maybe affinity, I don't feel the affinity. Why? Because you're dressed differently from me. You're talking with a different accent. You like a football team that I don't like. All of these things create a bias one way or the other. Now, you won't consciously think that, oh, you're a Chelsea supporter, I don't like you. This is happening unconsciously, and that's why it's so important to acknowledge and be aware of it, to press the pause button and just recognize that your gut feeling, your intuition about a person is being influenced by things that you shouldn't be influenced by. That's the key. Confirmation bias I've mentioned a number of times. Once you're on one side of neutral, your brain operates like a prosecuting counsel or a defending counsel. It only looks on one side. It looks for the evidence to support what you've already decided is the answer. Egocentric. We tend to see the world through our eyes. So we tend to put more emphasis on our activities. We see ourselves as having a bigger role in events than maybe we do. Experience bias is we tend to put a greater weight on our experience rather than what other people are saying. So let's say I'm dealing with a particular group of people in another company. Let's say it's a group of engineers in another company. I've been working on a project with them, and I've met them once at the setup meeting. I will tend to put a lot more emphasis on that setup meeting than the experience of people who've been working with those people for a year and come and tell me what they're like. So if I found them aggressive and difficult, I will tend to think that that's the way they are rather than that they're easy to work with, which is what my colleagues are telling me. Gender. Well, we saw that example earlier on with the car example. Home country, again, it's basically a form of the affinity bias. Benevolence bias. This is where we tend to have, how can I put it, a paternalistic view. We want to help people, and we assume that we will know more than they will know. And so we try to overhelp, if you like. And if you've ever been micromanaged by somebody who's operating from the goodness of their heart, you'll know how that bias can feel. Outcome bias is we tend to think that good results are the result of good decisions. And often they're not. We just got lucky. Or we can make exactly the right decision at the time the decision was made, given the available evidence, and it turns out to be wrong because of things which happened since then, or because of information which simply wasn't available. But we tend to focus on, but did you get the result? Okay, and selection bias, again, is we're looking at the wrong criteria when we're making selections. Okay, so I've just gone through very, very quickly 9 out of 150 types of bias. And it's about being aware. So, as I said, when are you likely to be aware? More prone to bias? When you're under pressure. When you have a lot to think about. Your conscious brain, system 2, has a limited capacity. You can only hold about 5 or 6 pieces of information in your working memory at any one time. So if you think about RAM in a computer, and that's all your conscious brain can access. Your unconscious brain, system 1, can access a lot more. So it can access the contents of your hard drive, and it can access them and look at lots and lots of information and emerge with patterns. The problem is it doesn't use the right criteria always in deciding what's important. So it jumps to conclusions based on patterns. Sometimes the patterns are right, sometimes wrong. So we need to reach closure. In other words, we need to make a decision quickly, tiredness, and strangely when we're relaxed and happy. So what I mean by that is there's simply not enough pressure to make us think hard about something, so we go with our gut reaction. Okay, so identify and compensate. Identify what your primary biases are. Talk to other people. Become aware of them. Read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Kahneman, and become aware of what your biases are. Reflect. Look back over your life. Look back over the decisions you've made in the last week, and see if you can identify any possibilities where bias may have crept in. So you can do several things at once, but only if they are easy and undemanding. Okay, so reduce the likelihood. I'm not going to read this out. You can read it out yourself. It's from Tim Minchin, a very famous speech that has got millions of hits on YouTube. And it's essentially saying you need to reflect a little. So check for assumptions before, during and after. Benchmark against standards. Talk with other people. That's, in answer to the earlier questions of what can we do, the number one thing I believe is talk to other people, but talk to them with an open mind. Don't talk to them as we invariably fall into the trap of, with a way to justify your idea. Ask open questions. Find out their perspectives. Don't necessarily share what you already think. Get the different perspectives. See ideas as neutral, not things to defend. Take the ego out of information and out of decision making. Build up checklists. How should the decision be made? Before you come to get the information, to accumulate all the information on which you'll make the decision, come up with a decision-making checklist of the criteria. If I share very briefly an example from my own life, my wife and I couldn't decide which car we were going to buy. So we, as you do, this is showing my my over-rational brain, I opened up Excel, put the short list of cars in column A, then identified what are the criteria for buying a car, and then scored each of the cars on those criteria. Criteria such as performance, economy, safety, and you can find out on the internet what the reviews are for each of the cars. But because, of course, I'm very rational, some things are more important. So the scores for economy and safety were uprated. So out of 10, the score would be multiplied by 1.3 or 1.2. So now it's a weighted matrix. Now, the obvious thing to do there is to choose the car with the highest score. So what do you think I did? I went back and changed the weighting until the car I wanted won. So you can see that even when you know the way to do it, evaluative criteria, checklist, objective information, your gut feeling, system one, can still come charging in and overrule if you're not careful. So talk to people. Now, the final point there is set a goal to be fair. This is really interesting. It's a psychological thing that if you literally say to yourself, I'm going to make a fair, reasonable, and just decision, you are much, much more likely to do it, because you trigger another bias, and that bias is the bias to act in a consistent way with the way that you've acted before. So simply tell yourself, I will be fair in this. So learn from past experience, reflect. There's a great quote by a guy called Deming that some of you may be aware of, the guy who is basically responsible for much of quality management and quality control. And he said, experience without theory teaches nothing. Experience without theory teaches nothing. In other words, you can do a job for 25 years and be no further advanced in your thinking than you were after the first 6 months, simply because you've never thought about it. You've never reflected. How could I do it better? What went wrong there? What other situations could this be used in? How could I bring something in from somebody else, from another discipline? So the key, I believe, and this is why it's the last one, it's the foundation of everything else, is to take time to reflect. So at the end of each day, take 5 minutes just to think back over the day and ask yourself, where could I have been biased? If I could live today all over again, what would I do differently? At what points should I have pressed pause? Because it's very difficult to press pause in the moment. So think about it at the end of the day, and maybe the next time you're in a similar situation, it's a little bit easier to press pause, and then it gets easier and easier and easier. So it's only about investing the effort in thinking and reflecting on the way that things have been. Okay, so I'm just going to look at a question here. Is there a tendency for someone in using System 1 or 2? Does it affect character? We're all prone to System 1 and System 2. There may be that there are some people, particularly introverts, who are likely to be a little bit more, think a little bit more consciously, but it doesn't mean that they're less prone to bias. So if you are an introvert, yes, you will probably over-process, which is the reason you're not talking all the time, because you're thinking, but you could just as easily be thinking in a biased way. So I don't think it's necessarily related to personality type. We're all susceptible to it, just as Kahneman himself admitted. Kahneman being an introvert. So that's just some of the ways in which you can think about it. Okay, I make it that we're 56 minutes into the webinar. So if there are any questions, more than happy to take them. Okay, I can see that there's one here from Daniel. How can we learn from past experience if we are biased by past experience? That is a really, really good question. I think it's really hard. The way I think you learn is you reflect, but you talk to other people. You in a kind of open and a deep way. You know, oh, you'll never guess what such and such said. You know, not that type of gossipy, superficial conversation. So it is about talking to people and then reflecting. So Martin's made the point about unconscious and conscious bias. The unconscious bias is essentially System 1. It's where things are happening under the radar. You're not even aware that you've received certain information. Conscious bias is you've received the information, it's just that you're processing it in the wrong way. So that's the difference, and the two are kind of working together. From Bede, as engineers, what biases are we most likely to encounter? Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think from my experience that there is possibly it's experience and confirmation bias. It's the idea that you've had a lot of experience, you know what you're talking about, and it can be very easy to assume you're the expert in an area that is very similar to areas situations you've encountered before, but is subtly different. That would be mine. Problem. It's a kind of bias of expertise. That would be my my point. Okay. Any further questions? Okay, Tom, great quote from Deming again. Yeah, he's full of fantastic quotes. So from Clara, how do you identify unconscious bias within a group of people? And there is a kind of group thing called groupthink, where people tend to think in a particular way. I think the answer there, Clara, is bring people in from the outside if you can. Get people to ask the stupid questions. This is going to sound terrible. I don't mean it to be, but one of the great strengths of my wife is she asks the stupid question. I've got these fantastic ideas, and she asks me the really, really basic question, the fundamental question, which I've forgotten about because everything has become so sophisticated in my thinking. I'm thinking about how I market my business, and she just comes back and asks this question: "Is yeah, but what will the customer be thinking at that point?" I think, yeah, okay. So it's not a stupid question. It's me who's stupid for not asking that really simple question. But get those kind of questions. Get people from the outside to come in and ask the questions. Ganesh, what measures can moving into the key thing, Ganesh, is never stop active listening. People think when they become leaders, they should start telling people what to do, and that's wrong. What you should do is listen even more. Another quote from Deming is, if you want to know how to put the wheel on the car better, ask the guy who puts the wheel on the car. That's an engineer bias. So you send a team of engineers in and they analyze it to death, but they've never picked up a wheel, or they've never picked it up for more than once or twice, where the guy who's putting the wheel on the car is picking it up 20 times an hour maybe. And you need to know how it feels after 3 hours of doing that. So Ganesh, moving into management, never stop listening. Be the listener. Lead by asking questions is what I would say. Okay, I'm going to have to stop now. Thank you all for your questions and involvement. I hope you found it useful. I'm going to shut up so that somebody else can step in just to say a little bit about other courses that are available.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Very informative webinar and very useful to us all. Yes, there are continuing webinars throughout the IMechE. You can see the training calendar that is available on imeche.org/training-qualifications. We will be sending a web link onto the chat attendee box there that will highlight where you can go along and view what other upcoming webinars we do have. So yeah, thank you very much for all coming along and joining the webinar session this afternoon. I do hope you found it useful, and hopefully we'll be able to see you on some of the next ones coming up over the coming months and into 2020. Okay, I'll say thank you very much, and hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.